you'll notice there really isn't very much similarity between this depiction of Jesus in the 300s and this probably about 1,000 or later. Here, in fact, the face is very long, the hair is straight, arched eyebrows like this, very long nose, long and slender. Is this the way Jesus looked? Well, this is probably the way a ruler looked at the time this illustration was made. So what is this picture here? Turns out that a popular magazine had an article a couple of years ago about a study that was done to reconstruct what a Semitic man would look like based on skulls from the era in which Jesus lived. And to the best reconstruction, the reconstruction done the same way that forensics reconstructs a victim from a skull by putting layers of clay on the skull in appropriate depth at various points where the flesh lies deep or shallow, and constructing a picture that probably is as good as any other and maybe more accurate than most as a picture of what Jesus probably looked like. Of course, we really don't know. We have no way of knowing. But the short hair, kind of bushy, much more typical of Semitic men of that era, and the beard cropped but not necessarily all that close, might be a very accurate depiction of what Jesus really looked like. But we'll see many, many pictures like this because as we move into the Middle Ages, Jesus and the apostles and various saints are depicted primarily the way that whoever was in charge in that area might have looked. Now here we have a very interesting piece of art that's once again telling a story. This comes from the catacombs where Christians were buried, in this case in around the 3rd century. There's a story in the book of Daniel about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were 3 Jews who had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon and were in the service of the king. The king issued an edict that whenever music was played, people would bow down and worship him. And these good Jewish men refused to do that. So the king got very angry and threw them in a fiery furnace, and they relied on their God to protect them. And in fact, God did protect them, and their clothing didn't even get singed. In fact, the furnace was so hot that the soldiers stoking it succumbed to the heat and fell in and burned up. But when these 3 men were thrown in, they survived and walked out. And this is, once again, religious art that's telling a story, and it's not intended to be high art. You simply have to understand that this is intended to mean fire, all that orange, and these are the 3 men, and their hands don't even have to be drawn very artistically. It's enough to remind you of the story. And their dress looks like the Persian dress of the time, so the culture influenced the way that they interpreted these men were dressed. This is kind of a forerunner of what happens with art in the Middle Ages in Western Europe. It loses any connection with artistry, and it becomes a vehicle by which to tell a religious story to people who probably can't read. Here we have a mosaic, Byzantine, that is the Eastern Roman Empire, after the fall of Rome, when the church is becoming a substitute essentially for the civil government. It's the institution that ties everything together. And here we have depiction of Empress Theodora. That was the mother of Constantine, the emperor who became a Christian. The Byzantines inherited a whole lot more influence from the Greeks than did the church in the western part of the Roman Empire. And here we see, implemented here in the stonework of the mosaic, we see an attempt to depict the same type of folds of the cloth that we saw in earlier sculpture, and the same here in the folds of that cloth. Now, these people are looking straight at you. Why is that? Well, in addition to telling a religious story, here it isn't so much a religious story. It's not a personage from the Bible, but it's a person who's becoming regarded as close to God, certainly closer than the people who attend the church. They're looking at you. And you'll see quite a bit of this artwork where part of the intention here was to establish control. You're being watched. That is, even when you're alone, you're being watched. Who is doing the watching but either God or people close to God? No actions are hidden. God knows your actions, and these viewers do too. We'll see that as another aspect of much of the art in churches. This is a portrait. Remember, portrait just means a sculpture that looks like somebody. But here we see what was happening to art as the Roman Empire fell apart. Its formal date of collapse is somewhat later than this. It's 476 when the last of the invaders took Rome. But Rome had been falling apart for hundreds of years, and artistry was going down the pipe with it. We see here some attempt at these folds of the cloth, and it's not really a bad impression of things, and the cloth draped over the arms. But if you were to look at this carving here of a face, it really is rather crude. Artists of this time were already learning how to use mechanical drills, that is, drills that were in some way powered, to mass produce things like this. And the intention here was just to show by way of the clothing, and maybe even painting applied to the clothing, that this was an official, and the face maybe was close to what the person looked like, or maybe not. Look in the Gombrich text and you'll see this head is really kind of crude. By comparison to Greek sculpture, this is kind of a hack job, and it's just sort of mass-produced, although created one piece at a time by hand. It's not exactly for the purpose of showing human beauty, but once again as a practical means of showing who's in charge, or at least the fact that there's an official present. Now here we have something that isn't in the Gombrich textbook. This is from the house of the Vertii in Pompei, preserved because it was covered with volcanic ash from the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, so we suspect this might have been created about the decade before. A wall painting, once again, the pigments to do this probably contained arsenic and were rather dangerous. The pigments to create the red were probably a compound of mercury and probably some sulfur. The interesting thing about this is there is an attempt here to make this window, this is really a window, or is it? It's not. It's a painting made to look like a window. There's an attempt here to show something in the distance, but it isn't as if they've caught on to what later was discovered in the Renaissance as linear perspective. That is a vanishing point. You see, these things tend to run parallel instead of running to a vanishing point. And we're going to see how that works in the next unit with linear perspective. But there was an attempt here to show something as it really appeared receding into the distance. Now the funny thing about this is, in this case, although this window is very close, this one seems from an entirely different point of view. So it's a little strange that there would be a structure that was shaped quite that way. It doesn't sit too well, but the techniques for doing this were not that well developed at the time. And here we see some artwork on the wall that does look fairly much like you could recognize people in it. Kind of a precursor of some of the later ages of art where people were using their eyes and painting what they actually saw, as opposed to painting something they imagined, either the Egyptians painting something with all possible information present, or the Greeks perhaps idealizing some human form and making it into something they didn't really see but they kind of would imagine. Here it appears that eyes are being used to actually picture things the way the eye perceives them. The only reason for this wall painting here is actually to show once again the difficulty in creating some colors in ancient times. Here's some natural earth compound as being used to represent green. It's a rather dull green. It was very difficult to come up with anything brighter than that in terms of green, and it might have been that this green was created by mixing yellow and blue pigment. We'll pursue that mixing of pigments in a later unit, but just realize for the moment that when you mix paints to create other colors, the resulting color is probably going to be duller than either of the two original colors. That's the function of the way the pigments work, and that may have been the case here, or it may have been a naturally occurring element that, when ground up and turned into paint, produced this kind of a green. Here's another picture. The reason for showing this once again from the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompei is the use of this red, which was probably a rather dangerous mercury compound, and the yellows here might have had arsenic involved. And very naturalistic type of painting here. Interesting, another use of a type of perspective that the Romans probably didn't even realize in an explicit way. This person here is clearly farther away from us than this person. And this person is farther away from us than this one. Why? For the simple reason that some of this person's body is hidden by this person. And that's a psychological clue that this person is closer. This person is partly hidden by this column and by this person's body. This is called positional perspective. It's one of 5 types of perspective we'll be studying in the next unit.